Hello, my name is Mr. Codilla, and today I'm going to be showing you how to glaze your clay projects, your ceramics projects. This project has been dried, but it has not been fired, so you see that it is a light gray color still and very fragile, very breakable. So this project right here has been fired. You'll notice the color is lighter and it's a lot harder as well. So this is called bisque. These two projects have been glazed and fired for a second time, so they're nice and shiny as well. We'll get back to those in just a minute, but I'm going to go ahead and show you our glaze as well. Notice that I'm working on scrap paper, which is very important. Now, we have glazes that come in tall bottles and short bottles. The tall bottles, we want to make sure we don't accidentally tip those over. Sometimes that happens. We want to be very careful with those. Now, many of the tall bottles, not all of them, but many of them have a crystal glaze in them. You'll see those little crystals or those little chunks in there as well. Those do different things inside the kiln. In fact, this example had crystal glazes in it, and sometimes they create a starburst or drip pattern there as well, which is kind of neat. So now I'm going to go ahead and start glazing my project here. I'm going to go ahead and open up this shorter glaze bottle here. Sometimes the glaze color stays exactly the same that you see in the bottle. Sometimes that color that you see in the bottle changes a lot when it's fired in the kiln. So the color should be listed on the side. Sometimes it's hard to find. This one says chartreuse, so this is sort of a green color. This will probably turn out to be a much brighter green than what we see in the bottle here. So I'll go ahead and start glazing my clay project. I'm going to dip the tip. I don't want to dip the paintbrush all the way down into the bottom. I'm just going to dip the tip right there. And I'm going to start glazing here. You could use a couple layers, a couple coats of glaze. So that means when you're done glazing a certain part, it'll dry. And in fact, glaze likes to dry really fast. So after it's dry, and you can see this part is actually dry already, just after a few seconds, I can go back over it with another layer of glaze. So you could put 2 different coats or 3 different coats of glaze on there. Now you'll see I have some little holes and some little divots there. If you have cracks or little holes or divots, you have to get some glaze on the tip, and then you need to poke that glaze into those little holes and divots. So sometimes this takes a little extra time. You want to make sure you get all around every single little piece. Like for example, I'd have to turn this project to the side and turn the brush to the side and make sure that I can get underneath this part right here as well. So I want to make sure that I'm glazing every single part except for the bottom of my project. We don't want glaze on the bottom. In fact, if you get glaze on the bottom, it's easy to go ahead and wipe that off with a wet paper towel. It's very easy to get glaze off. It'll wash right off your hands too. The reason why we don't put glaze on the bottom is if glaze gets on the bottom on purpose or even on accident, if it sits on the kiln shelf and gets fired, that glaze will act like glue and fuse, stick your project to the kiln shelf. It won't come off, or at least won't come off very easily. So we don't want glaze on the bottom. Now sometimes people accidentally get glaze on the bottom because there might be a little glaze, for example, on the scrap paper, and then they put their project, they don't notice it, and then they put their project right on top of that glaze dot, and so they need to get that cleaned off with a wet paper towel. Again, you still want to glaze everything else inside and outside except for the bottom. Don't put glaze on the bottom. Another thing I want to talk about too is when we are glazing, you don't want to leave your brush inside the bottle, especially these tall bottles right here, because it'll just sink down to the bottom. You want to leave your brush on the scrap paper so that it doesn't make a mess. Do remember to use scrap paper the entire time you're working. Now you can actually take glaze, different colors, and put them on top of each other. For example, let's just imagine I go to a different table that has this glaze on it. I can have a different paintbrush, and sometimes we need to get smaller paintbrushes for detail work, and you could put a different glaze color right on top. Sometimes those colors mix. Sometimes the color on top is the only one that shows in the end. Sometimes the one on the bottom is sometimes the one that shows a little bit more. It just depends on what kind of glazes you're using. They become sort of like an experiment. In fact, when I do this, you'll see actually I could put some extra glaze on there, and you can see some of those little crystals, those little chunks of extra glaze in there as well. So it's sort of an experiment when you layer glazes on top of each other.